So, hello, everybody. I've really got a special guest. I guess I say that for all my guests, but some are really special with the capital S. And this gentleman, Jason Staples, his name even starts with a capital S. He's easy to find, jasonstaples.com, no space. Just type it out. You'll love the site. I'm going to show it to you in a minute. But I want to tease you with our topic first, and then I'll introduce him a little bit. I want to talk about not all 68, and there could be more, but I tried to count them today. How many times the word Israel occurs in the New Testament? Just those documents. And I know it's right. Let's just say 70, because who knows exactly. And I checked an English translation. What does it mean in all those places? But what I've done, Jason, let's see, I picked a passage in Romans. It's a letter of Paul, passage in Galatians, passage in Philippians, and I think that's it. That way we can limit ourselves to Paul. And we're going to tell people in 1 minute, they're going to have to hold on to get the suspenseful announcement. Why would we decide to do Paul on this particular day, on this particular date? Because there's a real reason. Something is coming up that involves Jason, it involves me, but it also involves 8 other scholars of Paul. I noticed I didn't say Pauline, even though that's the term we use. I always thought it was strange to a non-initiate because like there's this woman named Pauline and everybody is studying her, like thousands of people are studying Pauline. So Jason's got a sense of humor. That's why I like him so much and other reasons. So I'm going to share my screen and just show you his page. I think that's the fastest way to introduce him. And then we're going to give you the big surprise. And then we're going to talk about what is the meaning of Israel, the term Israel in Paul. Now, Jason, he might be at a loss for words because he's only written 2 books on this subject, like thick books with Cambridge University Press. But I think he's going to be able to hold his own on the topic. We'll see. Okay, here's his page, jasonstaples.com. It's a great website. I've played around with it the last week or so since we set this up. This is the way a website should be set up. You all are going to agree. There's the books. You can click on them. You can even order a signed copy and then look at all of these other things if you want to follow different accounts of his X. And this is a new thing that you're starting, I think, maybe, and all kinds of things. You should just go through this. You can see blog posts. Jason is really out there. He does a variety of things. But let's just read his formal. He wrote this, I assume, unless his wife did. Jason A. Staples, PhD, UNC Chapel Hill, and I'm going to add a PhD student of Bart Ehrman. That's a name that many of you will know. He's an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at North Carolina State University, just down the road from where I am, Charlotte. Speaker, journalist, voice actor, and former American football coach. Jason, these are future programs we're going to do. Plus, I want to come on and talk about your shirt because I use that same program, Biblingo, and I think we should talk about it. A lot of people want to know, how do I learn Hebrew? How do I learn Greek? And you said your kids were even learning from this every day, so
Yep.
that's so cool.
Yep. Got a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old
Yeah.
that are on Biblingo almost every day.
Wow, that's so amazing. So look, you've got about Jason, much more, the blog, speaking, contacting him, CVs. It's just such a manageable website. So go for it. Subscribe. I just subscribed to his Substack. I hadn't yet. And I thought, what am I waiting on? So I'm already signed up for that. The other thing is the surprise. Everybody ready? Now, a Bible conference for non-scholars. What does that mean? Is it for dumb people that don't know anything? Absolutely not. In fact, we had this last year. Look, NINT 23. I happened to be on last year. Jason wasn't because I also specialize in historical Jesus. And NI is New Insights. And I'm telling you, Bart Ehrman runs a tight ship. Jason was his student. He knows. If he says new insights, don't get out your old syllabi, something you've been teaching for the last year or two. new insights into the New Testament. I think when Bart started, he didn't know he would do years to come. I'm not sure. I remember him telling me, let's try this out. It was a amazing success. A couple thousand people came. It's virtual. You don't have to travel. And what we mean by non-scholars, Jason and I go to these academic meetings, SBL, AR, you know, Society of New Testament Studies, and people do microscopic papers, God love them, on, you know, Romans 3, 1 through 6, which actually you could do a good paper on. There's a lot to say about Romans 3, 1 through 6. But this isn't that. This is overviews, and it's on September 21st and 22nd. If you can't go live and watch it as it's happening, doesn't matter. You're going to own the recordings. You can go back, and there's all kinds of other events. I'm going to put the link in the description, but here's the mug shots of all of us that are going to be on it. And you can pick out Jason there. Hey, we happen to be next to each other. It must be the alphabet. But I'm telling you, I know you know this guy. And you probably know Robin. She's Paula Fridrickson. Oh, I honor her so much.
She's amazing.
What a Paul scholar. I've learned so much from her. She's going to be teaching, and all these others, really. Now, here are the topics. I guarantee if you read these topics, and you can click on them and read more, I mean, there's nothing like this. When Bart first advertised it, he made the most extravagant statement I've ever heard him make. He said, this is the most significant conference of the year for the non-specialists. And I thought, yeah, it's one of the only ones. But also when you look, here's Jason's, not by faith alone. Paul's gospel wasn't what you, quote, probably think. So you could already see the spirit of this. We have so much fun. Was it Paul the law and the Jewish people? Joel Marcus? Joel is just one of those people Jason and I look to all of our lives. Robin doing Paul as a philosopher. I mean, middle Platonism and Stoicism. Did Paul have anything to do with that? Paul's sexual vocabulary. You can't talk about biblical sexuality, early Christian sexuality without knowing the meaning of the words. And that's the day one. And then day two, let's see, September 22nd. There's Paul and the Pagan Gods. That's Paula Fridrickson. I'm going to talk about Paul's greatest idea and how it was suppressed. Reimagining time, grace and giving. You know, you think giving is just this thing you do in church, but there's some politics behind this collection that Paul was taking. And then Dr. Ehrman will finish it off. So I'm so excited about this, Jason, but I want us to talk about what you've been working on for years. And I'll give you my passages. I think you're the kind of person who's worked enough on Paul that I won't have to repeat these. So one is Romans 2:28. You don't have to do these in order. I just know we can't do everything Paul says about Israel. You can handle this any way you want. Basic question is, what does Paul mean when he says Israel? So here's some passages. He is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision something external and physical. He is a Jew who is one inwardly. And real circumcision is a matter of the heart, spiritual, not literal. Okay, number two, Galatians 6:15 and 16. For neither circumcision counts for anything, you know, being Jewish basically, nor uncircumcision, but a new creation. Now listen to this final phrase. Peace and mercy upon all who walk by this rule, upon the Israel of God. But what does he mean by Israel of God there? Because it sounds like it might include Gentiles or anybody who walks by this rule. Philippians 3:5. Now this one's rough. Look out for the dogs. Look out for the evil workers. Look out for those who mutilate the flesh. Paul could be kind of straightforward, let's call it. We are the circumcision who worship God in spirit and glory in Jesus Christ and put no confidence in the flesh. And finally, there's two here, but it's what you wrote your dissertation on in a new book. It is not as though the word of God has failed. Jason already knows where this is, but I'll tell him Romans 9, verse 6. For not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel. boy, now we're going to really get into it. And Romans 11, telling his Gentile converts, some of them may be Jewish, at Rome, he never met them, lest you be wise in your own conceits. I want you to understand this mystery, this secret, brethren. A hardening has come upon part of Israel until the full number of the Gentiles come in. And so all Israel will be saved. The most difficult passage in Paul, and Jason decided to write a book on it, so, or a dissertation. So I'll jump in back and forth, but you handle those any way you want, bring in any others you want, and just talk about what does Paul mean by Israel? And what do people traditionally think he means? And are they right? Are they wrong? Whatever you want to do with it. We'll have fun.
Yeah, I think the place to start for this, excuse me, the place to start for this is Paul is not inventing words for himself. He's using words that already have he's participating in a discourse that pre-exists him.
Mhm.
This is something that when he's using these terms, he's using them in the context of a community where these terms already have meaning. And so actually what I did to try to answer these questions, because these are thorny questions when we're looking uh, at Paul, what I tried to do is first of all establish, okay, for a hearer of Paul in the first century, what would they assume these words mean? And then we can kind of look at what Paul does with that. And I think to some degree, there's been a certain amount of laziness within scholarship to presume that we kind of know what these words mean. Like, well, we know what Israel means. You know, we know what Jews are. Because these categories still exist today, and so there's this sense of just applying modern notions to these concepts and just presuming that Paul means by them the same things that they would mean to, say, a 21st century English speaker. And so I think the place to start is to say that that doesn't seem to actually be the case.
Mhm.
That when we actually look at how these words are used used by Paul's contemporaries, people like Philo or Josephus, Philo of Alexandria. Your audience, many will be aware of these
And
people to
that's
some degree.
you're
Yeah, and this
talking,
is this book, right?
yeah, the
So,
idea of Israel, but not today.
right, in
Could
Second
be
Temple
today,
Judaism.
but
So,
it might not
yeah,
be. Yeah.
yeah. So how are these people, Philo, Josephus, predecessors, in immediately prior generations, places like in the book of Daniel, or First and Second Maccabees, and the book of Tobit, going back to the biblical prophets. There's a whole lot of material where we're looking at how. So what I did in that book is I looked at how those different contemporary and prior Jews, so Paul's contemporaries and Jews prior to him, how they used these terms. And ultimately, what I determined is that there's a pretty consistent way of understanding both terms and their relationship to one another. So this is specifically
Mhm.
the term Israel or Israelite, and its cognates, and Jew or Jews as a category as well. And one thing that's been typically presumed in biblical scholarship today has been that those terms are essentially coextensive, that they overlap, that, there's a Venn diagram between Israelite and Jews, or Israelite and Jew. Those two, it's a circle, right? Jews are Israelites, Israelites are Jews, and they're synonymous, coextensive. You just use them in different contexts for various reasons.
Yeah,
And
we
one of
do
the
we do
one,
that today all the time. Yeah. Or
right? You might say, an American is a U.S. citizen, right? Those tend to be used in that way. Something like that would be close. Though you could argue, a Canadian is an American in a different way, although normally that's not how that term gets used. Um, so that's one way that that's presumed, and and the explanation for why these terms are used differently, because they don't, if they were exactly synonymous and coextensive, you'd kind of expect them to be used interchangeably, where they would appear, like if you looked at the scatter plot of how they appear in various literature, it would be, sort of random. It's just like, well, I'm going to use this one or I'm going to use this one. But there are patterns there where, for example, in uh, Philo of Alexandria, when he's in certain tractates where he's referring to Jews, he doesn't use the term Israel or Israelite.
That's
And
interesting.
then in tractates where he uses the term Israel or Israelite, he doesn't use the term Jews. There's one exception to that, where there's a tractate where both terms appear in it, and they're separated by, I can't remember the exact number, but it's like 228 lines. He's switched subjects by that point. Otherwise, he's talking about two different. It depends on what he's talking about and to whom he's talking about, maybe, right? So one explanation for this, and in Josephus, there's a similar divide, which we'll talk about in a second. But one explanation for this has been, well, one is the preferred insider term. So Jews are Israelites, Israelites are Jews, but insiders, so Jews themselves prefer to call themselves Israelites. That's the covenantal name that they prefer when they're referring to one another, but outsiders called them Jews. And sometimes, and this goes back to a specific article in 1937 or 38, I can't remember which one, that was written by K.G. Kuhn for the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament. He wrote that article and he explained that this was the explanation. He said, outsiders, it's outsider language to talk about Jews. Insider language, when they're talking to themselves, they say Israelite. And when Jews are talking to outsiders, they adopt the outsider language. That's the explanation. And
So
he
like
then
it's almost
explains,
slang to say Jew then, or just
well, it's more than that. He actually says that on the lips of outsiders, it can take a depreciatory sense, that
yeah, right.
it's negative, it's derogatory in some way.
Yeah, right.
Now, the interesting thing is when you actually go through all the data, there's really nowhere in ancient literature where Jew is used in this way, in a derogatory
Wow.
sense. And several
Wow.
scholars have pointed this out.
Mm-hmm.
And where Kuhn cites this in the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, he says, sometimes with the, depreciatory sense, he doesn't actually cite any places where that's the case, which is
And then it
interesting.
gets read by students and by us as grad students, and then we begin to say, "Oh, well, the way these are used are."
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So yeah, this
And
is.
here's the thing. Kuhn was writing this article in 1930s Germany,
Yeah.
where calling someone a Jew did have a derogatory sense to it. And German Jewish communities in the 1930s and afterwards being referred to as the Israelitische Gemeinde, the Israelite community, rather than as Juden, as Jews, because Juden had a derogatory sense in Germany in the 1930s. Moreover, Kuhn himself was one of the first 1,000 people to join the Nazi Sturmabteilung, the SA, and brought in some of these modern presuppositions that colored the way that he looked at the ancient data. So what I did in that book is I said, look, this model that we've been borrowing from Kuhn's article going back to the 1930s doesn't hold up. The explanation here of the data doesn't work. There is another explanation, though, and that's that these two terms go back to essentially a biblical prehistory, where Israelite is a covenantal term that refers to people from multiple different tribal groups that that identified themselves tribally. And if you read the Jewish Bible, if you read the Hebrew scriptures, when you read that, you discover that there's two kingdoms. There's the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, each of which comprise, together, when you put them together, that comprises greater Israel. right? So you have all Israel, that's, the whole 12 tribe unit of all of those. And then you have the northern tribes that go by Israel and the southern tribes that get called by Judah, which is the dominant tribe in the south. And then they have separate fates, right? So 8th century northern Israelites, the northern kingdom of Israel ceases to be a separate kingdom. Judah tries to sort of reestablish a greater Israel in a variety of different ways. It never quite takes. And then Judah gets exiled by Babylon. Some people return from Babylonian exile, 100 years later, basically, or 70 years later. So you have this whole backstory there. And the thing that we find is that in the wake of all of this turmoil, political turmoil, uh, the exiles that are happening in all of this, and the deportations and returns and all of this, the people associated with the Southern Kingdom get labeled Jews
Right. Right.
because they are from the kingdom and that is dominated by the tribe of Judah, the kingdom that goes by the name Judah. And then you have them still looking back to a period of unification with the Northern Kingdom and a common cultic identity with the people from the Northern Kingdom of worshiping the same God under a covenantal relationship that is a covenant with the people of Israel, of which Judah is a subset, is a part.
Right.
And
Right.
then when you start reading the biblical prophets, both pre and post exilic prophets are looking forward to a time when God, the God of Israel, will do what he promised and bring about a restoration of all of the people of Israel
Mhm.
and reestablish them as his favored people, give them, elevate them above the nations and use them to bring, well, not just use them. There's a variety of different, ways of explaining how this is going to happen. There's, it's not a unified voice here, but basically either using them to bring about justice in the world or bringing about justice in the world, which accompanies their being elevated to the head of the nations. So
Exactly.
how you
Right.
exactly take that. So and this is the coming of the kingdom of God when you get to the
Right.
gospels, for example, when Jesus shows up and says the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God is at hand, repent and believe the good news. He is proclaiming this. He's saying God is going to fulfill his covenantal promises to the whole people of Israel, the whole people, 12 tribes and all, are going to be restored at the head of the nations, and God is going to bring justice on earth.
And
And it's
that's why we
starting now.
get that saying in the two sources, Luke and Matthew, about sitting on thrones, judging the 12 tribes. And
The 12 tribes of
yeah.
Israel. And the
Yeah, my
thing is,
students
that's such a,
always ask me that. There's a passage somebody found in Kings, I don't remember where, but the Jews are at war with Israel. And they go, what was that, like a breakaway group that didn't like? I said, nothing to do with the modern state of Israel, first of all. Secondly, it's confusing to people. And then if we throw Paul in, like how is he
yeah,
using it, which is your specialty? Yeah.
exactly.
Wow.
So,
Scrambled eggs, you know?
so when Jesus says this, 12 tribes of Israel are, you're going to sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. The thing we have to remember is in Jesus' day, there aren't 12 tribes of Israel out there running around in the land, right?
Saying,
The
here I
tribe of
am.
Reuben
Yeah.
hasn't been
Right.
seen for
Mhm.
a long, long time at that point. And so he's proclaiming a much bigger thing than it
So that's an
sounds,
extraordinary statement. It's not just some, oh, really? You're going to do that? It's like, what? Yeah.
yeah, it's like, where are you getting Reuben from? How are they going to be brought back?
And there's
That's what
a
he's proclaiming.
Naphtali, and some people have heard of Joseph and some of the tribes, but you start naming some of them, and they go like, "Oh yeah, never heard that
Yeah,
one."
where's Gad been for a while,
Gad,
right?
yeah, where's Gad been all these years? Yeah.
Yeah, or Dan. These are things that, so this connects with that. So this is the backstory that Paul is presuming when he
Okay.
starts to use these terms. And so then by the time we get to Paul's letters, he's trying to explain, first of all, Paul's writing in the wake of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. And he says, look, I've seen the resurrected Christ, the resurrected Messiah of Israel, and the promises of God, which is this whole subset of stuff that I just talked about. Those promises are being fulfilled through this heavenly enthronement of the Israel's Messiah, who I've seen. Now he is proclaiming this, but he has a lot to explain. And the natural question for someone to whom Paul is preaching in the first century when Paul comes in and says, I am proclaiming that God has begun to fulfill his promises as he promised to Abraham and to the prophets and all of these things. He's doing it right now. The most natural question is to go, yeah, so where are the 12 tribes exactly?
Yeah, he's not going to be king over just the little kingdom of Judea if he's the Messiah that's going to reconstitute Israel. Yeah. So we're
Right. So where's the rest of Israel, Paul? Like how exactly is this working? And then he's got another thing to explain, and that's that he's bringing in men with foreskins who are not Jews. They are not, you know, at least recognizably, and as far as anybody can tell, there's no evidence that any of these people are from Israelite stock.
yeah.
What do they have to do with this?
And
So
he
he's got
calls
two things to
them,
explain.
yeah, he calls them, well, Gentiles probably not the best word, but they're part of the nations and so forth.
Right.
Yeah.
Or pagans. I mean, Paula Fredrickson brings that word in as well. And I think
Mhm.
that's a productive word in certain senses, because
Mhm.
these are non-Jews. They're not from Israelite stock in this way. And so the promise is with Israel for the restoration of Israel. You look at like the new covenant promise that Paul himself cites, the new covenant promise in Jeremiah 31, where he says, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah.
Yeah, that is something because if he cites it,
Right.
the
So,
students have picked, I'm sure yours have too. They've picked up on some of this, especially that Jeremiah 31:31. And then Paul says, and we're ministers of a new covenant. And they go like, okay, now I'm very confused
right.
because
So again, the thing to ask is like, but this doesn't say that the covenant is with Gentiles, Paul. What are you doing with this whole Gentile thing? And where again, it's this restoration of Israel that, we would be expecting. So now he's got to explain those two things together. And that brings us then to how he uses these terms. And when we come into Romans 2:28, for example, which is the first one that you mentioned, this is at the tail end of Romans chapter 2, which is, he's laid out from the beginning in chapters 1 and 2 of Romans. He lays out the essentially the backdrop of Israel's history in the context of Israel and all the nations, right? So he lays out, interestingly, in chapter 1, he starts with when you get that thesis of, he's preaching the gospel, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus the Messiah, uh, and then he starts with, because the wrath of God is revealed against the impiety and injustice, against all impiety and injustice of humans. And he lays down then this whole
yeah,
narrative
you
of
can't
people.
read it in one breath. It's like,
Right. Yeah. He lays out this whole narrative of people descending into idolatry and then sexual immorality and, injustices of all sorts and total disobedience to the will of God in a way that, that matches in certain ways traditional Jewish polemics against Gentile, alleged Gentile behaviors, stereotypical Gentile behaviors. But he does it in a way where he's also peppering in there citations to Israel's participation in these same sins. And then when you get to chapter 2, he says, oh, and by the way, you also are not without fault, and starts to talk, about, well, doesn't seem that having that possession of the Torah did a whole lot to prevent Israel from doing this, from Jews from doing this. And if you are called a Jew and you do these things, then what makes you any different?
yeah, and
So
that's
then by the
logical.
time,
Yeah, everybody that
yeah,
hears that thinks, yeah, you don't get commended just by claiming you have a name. You have to have the behavior. Yeah, it makes
right. And so Paul is not saying something that would be untoward among pretty close to any Jewish group of his day. For him to say, like, look, being a Jew, having been circumcised on the eighth day, that really doesn't mean that you have like a get, eschatological salvation free card, guys. You have to actually obey the will of God as revealed in the Torah. That's not controversial for Jews in the first century to say this. It's not generally controversial for observant Jews today to say this, right? So what he does is he comes in and he says, look, God is going to judge everybody based on a standard of justice that is, he establishes elsewhere, that it's revealed in the Torah. So when he judges people, he says, because there's no partiality with God, right? There's going to be tribulation and distress for every life, every human who does evil, and there's glory, honor, and peace and life to everyone who does good, to the Jew first and also to the Greek.
Yeah, we
So
call
he
that
established,
justice. That's fairness.
right,
Like, how else
right,
would God act? He's not going to reward a wicked Jew and, curse righteous Gentiles. So
right.
makes
So
sense. Yeah.
Paul is on traditional footing here, where he says this. This is, if you read Abraham Heschel, one of the things that I think is so useful about or so helpful about how he explains some of this in his amazing book, The Prophets,
Yes.
is he talks about how the single most differentiating characteristic of the God of Israel is the God of Israel is just. There's no capriciousness. There's no sense of this God is just going to kind of go and act arbitrarily. No, you can know where you stand with the God of Israel based on your behavior, and that this is something that's actually fairly different, Heschel argues, from a lot of the gods of the from the other gods of the ancient Mediterranean, where Zeus just may do whatever Zeus wants, and
Yeah.
whether you're just or not, may okay, well, you're an attractive female or male, and Zeus just may decide he wants you.
Yeah.
It's completely arbitrary. But the God of Israel doesn't work that way. With the God of Israel, you get what you deserve. And that's what Paul says in Romans 2. And so he makes this whole case in Romans 2 to say, if you have the Torah, if you have been circumcised, all of these other things, ultimately none of that matters for your in terms of the last judgment, unless you keep the Torah itself, unless you obey, right? So what he says is, as we get a little bit further, you who boast in the Torah, Romans 2:23, you who boast in the law, through your breaking the Torah, do you dishonor God? And then he says, look, circumcision is of value if you do the Torah, but if you are a violator of Torah, then your circumcision has turned into a foreskin. And then we get finally to the verse that you cited, for it is not for the Jew in visible things is not a Jew, nor is circumcision in visible things in flesh, but the Jew in the hidden things
Yes.
is a
Right.
Jew, and his circumcision of the heart in spirit, not letter, whose approval is not from humans but from God. So all he's saying here is, look, if you are a Jew, and this refers to that subset of people from Judah within Israel, and of course, Israel has been given the Torah and has been given instructions to behave justly and with piety towards God. If you behave in this way and you keep the Torah, then your circumcision has value, and you will be judged as just, and your participation, your continued status as a Jew, as a person within this subset of Israel, is secure. But if you don't do those things, then you are ultimately putting yourself in position to be cut off from that status. And
So
this is
would he call a righteous Gentile or one who follows the Torah of the heart? Is he willing to call them Israelites or Jews?
well.
It's
So
sort of implied. Yeah.
this is where I think we go to the next passages where he uses different language, because
Okay.
now when we go to like Galatians 6 and we go to Philippians 3 and to Romans
Right.
11, he doesn't actually use the term Jew in these. He
Yeah,
uses the
you're
term
right.
Israel
Yeah.
or Israelite, right? And the reason he makes that switch is because now he's talking about this larger covenantal community of the people of God that is not restricted to Judah or the people associated with Judah, with that, with that heritage. And as I understand Paul, what he does is he makes a couple of different interpretive moves here. Specifically, he reads the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32, which is a strong undercurrent throughout a lot of the Pauline corpus. And then he also cites Hosea chapter 9 or Hosea chapter 1, chapter 2, where you have this proclamation in Hosea where Hosea is prophesying to the northern kingdom of Israel, not to the southern kingdom of Judah. And the northern kingdom of Israel, Hosea says, has become idolatrous to the place where they, as the covenantal people of God, have been cut off. God is saying, I'm divorcing you.
Yeah.
You have been so unfaithful to me that I am divorcing you and I'm sending you away. You are no longer in covenant with me. This is, the
You're not my
fundamental
people. I'm
message.
not your God. Like,
Right.
you're
He
not my
undoes the
wife. You're not my husband. Bye. Yeah.
exactly. So he undoes the language of the covenant, which is, I will be your God, or I am your God and you are my people, right? Well, here you are not my people and I am not your God. This is divorce language. Jeremiah refers to this moment later as well as giving your sister Samaria or your sister Israel a writ of divorce. But Hosea says to them, you are not my people and I am not your God. And then says, you're going to be scattered, right? Uh, Interestingly, this does not apply to Judah, right? Hosea does not say this to Judah. Judah does not get divorced,
It's so important to see that. Yeah.
right? And this is really important to note that, as far as I know, no Jewish interpreter historically, I'm unaware of any single Jewish interpreter who reads Hosea 1 and 2 and says that applies to Jews in any way.
That's right.
Because there's awareness that this refers to the northern kingdom of Israel, not to the southern kingdom of Judah, from which the modern Jews continue to be derived, essentially. So what Hosea does is he says this has happened, and then he also says, and this is the crazy thing about it, but one day I will say to those who are not my people, right? One day I will bring you back and I will restore you in some way.
So that's what Jesus is picking up on, really. Yeah.
Right. So Jesus picks up on this, and then Paul picks
Paul
up on
picks up
this.
on it. Mhm.
And Paul makes an interesting move here where, and you can see how he does this with some sophisticated exegesis and argumentation in Romans 11, or Romans 9 to 11 in particular. But what he does is he essentially reads Hosea and says, okay, so God cuts off the northern Israelites and says, you are not my people, but then says, I'm going to bring my people back. And that's going to be how I'm going to restore Israel once again. And then he looks around and he says, and now we've got uncircumcised Gentiles who are being filled with the Holy Spirit somehow. And that's kind of surprising because the Holy Spirit that they're receiving in some way is the spirit that's promised to Israel as a part of the restoration of Israel.
Oh, yeah. It says, I'll pour out my spirit on you and so
I
forth.
will pour out my spirit on you. And who's that promised to? To Israel and to Judah. This is Ezekiel chapter 36. This is, Joel chapter 2. And so now he's got to make sense of this. And then he latches onto this and he says, wait a second. But Hosea says, I will call those who are not my people, and I'll bring, wait a second. Gentiles are not my people. They're receiving the spirit that is given to Israel, that's promised to Israel. And this seems to be how God is actually restoring Israel. There's the Jewish portion of Israel, which is identifiable in a different way. And then there's the rest of Israel that has to be restored somehow else. And my argument is that Paul makes a very sophisticated exegetical argument to arrive at the conclusion that these uncircumcised Gentiles who are receiving the Spirit are actually being ethnically transformed into restored Israel to be in union with the restored Spirit-filled people from Judah to comprise all Israel. And so
Wow.
this is what he then is doing in Romans 9 to 11, is he's explaining this backstory of how this works.
Now
And
I've got to
so,
ask you this
yeah,
personal question. When you first proposed that to Bart Ehrman, just the core idea, and I remember when I read your, I think it was a JBL article, um, and I had studied Romans 9 through 11. I think I did a graduate paper on 11:25. What does all Israel mean? And I was sort of leaning towards things like that, but I didn't know anybody else that was thinking that. What did Professor Ehrman, did he immediately latch onto it, or did he go, well, I don't know. I think they're Gentiles. Well, they are Gentiles, whatever they're among the nations. But somebody said to me, well, don't say lost tribes, say scattered tribes, because lost sort of means like, hey, I lost this 10 years ago. I'm never going to find it. Scattered means, you know,
yeah, scattered is
so,
better.
so what did he think? Because people follow Bart. I'd like, because this is a new idea. This is really, I
Yeah.
know.
So this goes back to would have been either late 2007 or early 2008.
Mhm.
So I was TAing for Bart, and we were this was just before one of his lectures. We were walking over there, and he was saying, hey, it's starting to get to be the point where you need to kind of figure out what you might want to write on.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's right. I know
and
that
I
feeling.
said, oh, I already know what I'm going to write on. He's like, really? Well, why don't you let me in on this?
That's
And uh, so I just briefly, about 2 minutes, 5 minutes or so, laid this out and said, I think this is what's going on, and I think it needs to be explained and fully, uh, fully explicated, because I think this solves a lot of problems for, various conundra that are that exist within Pauline scholarship, or within scholarship of Paul. Uh, and Mark kind of turned and looked at me, and he goes, "All right, so how many classes on Paul have you taken? How many classes on Paul have you taken?" It's like, where this seems kind of I haven't
Le-
seen anybody that's made any case like this. And I said,
yeah,
none.
left field. Yeah, where are you coming from?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he kind of looks at me funny. He goes, and I go, none. I've not taken any classes on Paul. And then he goes, yeah, this kind of sounded like kind of like the work of an autodidact. So I haven't seen anything that kind of looks anything like this. This is pretty far out there. So why don't you go over to Duke and take a few classes with Joel Marcus and Douglas Campbell and Richard Hayes and a few guys and Paul, and kind of run this by them and see
And
what they
Joel's
think.
going to be
Because
in our seminar. Yeah,
right,
in our
so
conference.
he
So
he
yeah.
he basically said, I think once you get there and they kind of get
Mhm.
their hands on this, you'll have to you'll have to do something else, because they'll explain why this doesn't work. So then to this gets funnier, because what happened after that is the call for papers for SBL, for the next SBL, went out shortly after that, and I naturally submitted the the proposal for what became the 2011 JBL article that you're mentioning there, for the 2008 SBL up in Boston,
Is that on
for the
your
Paul.
academia page where people, or do they have to subscribe? Do you know if it's available?
It's available online. I don't put anything on academia, but it is available for download.
I'll
And
put,
if anybody ever has any trouble
I'll
with it, you
tell
can email
people the
me.
exact citation and they could probably
Yeah,
write you and get a copy. Yeah.
yeah, they can definitely get one from me if they can't find it.
Yeah, that would be
But
something to read to kind of trace the history of this idea because it is really new. Yeah,
yeah. So I submitted that to the Pauline Epistle section for that year, and it got accepted. Now, what I didn't know is that this is my first year at UNC. I'm a first year grad student. I didn't know that it was protocol to run your SBL proposals or whatever through BART before you ever submitted that. I mean, I just did it. So so then
yeah, you
we get
could
to
embarrass your
yeah.
professor, right?
Well, you can embarrass yourself and your professor easily. I just presumed, I got an idea. I'll go ahead and put it in, and if I get accepted, I'll present it. So we get to SBL, and I present I presented that paper, and it was a standing room only. I mean, there were people out in the hallway for that particular paper, and uh, it was a very well attended session. And anyhow, so I then the next day was in the book exhibit, and Robert Jewett, and you knew Bob,
Oh
right?
yeah.
So
Right.
Bob, just a wonderful, wonderful man. Uh, Corners me in the book exhibit. He sees me and pulls me into a bookstall and shakes me. He says, "I wanted to shake your hand. I was at your talk yesterday, and
Wow.
I just wanted to let you know I've been working on that question for the last 30 years, and I think you've solved it.
Oh my
And I
goodness.
just wanted
That
to
is
know, like, is this part of a larger project? Is this like, what are you doing a book on this? Like, where is this going? Because it needs to be out there, and I really think you just solved this." And he said, and the thing I have to tell you is, the thing that's most sort of impressed me or most impacted me on thinking about this the last day is that you were willing to follow the data wherever it went, whereas the rest of us just stopped short. And he's like, I just, is there anything? And then I mentioned to him, I said, yeah, I mentioned, I'm hoping to do this for my dissertation, but I'd mentioned it to Bart, and he's a little skeptical because it's kind of out there, and there's nothing else in
well, the
there. And he
Jewett
said, well,
reference probably helped.
yeah. So Bob looks at me and he says, well, would you like me to reach out to Bart and let him know that this absolutely needs to be done? And he said, I would like to be an outside reader if at all possible.
Wow.
Uh,
That's
and
amazing.
I guess within the day, Bob had gotten in touch with Bart and had basically said, "I want to be an outside reader. This absolutely needs to be done. This is revolutionary to the field, etc." Because later that day, we had a Bart always has a separate reception for his current and former students that we all get together and spend some
Sure.
time together. And I get there, and Bart walks over to me and he goes, "What did you present today?" Or what did you present yesterday? Like, it's like, oh, I presented the Romans
Right through
11
11.
thing that I
Yeah.
mentioned to you. And one of his old students, Stephanie Cobb, looks at me and goes, "You presented something he didn't know about? Like, you he hadn't read your thing in advance?" I was like, "Well, I couldn't have read it in advance. I didn't finish it until the night before." And she just looks at me and goes, "You were an anomaly." And Bart goes, "Ha! You look up anomaly in the dictionary and you find his picture." But that ended up being the impetus. That was enough where Bart was like, "Okay, well now, like, if Bob's on board with this, nobody knows the bibliography of Paul better than Bob.
That's
Uh,
true.
if
Yeah.
Bob's on board with this, then you should probably do this. We'll make sure that your committee is adequately strong in areas to push on you to make sure that this is done well." And we had several different committee changes that had to happen. Bob ultimately rotated off for a few reasons, but he helped early on. Uh,
And the
and
reason I mentioned the
that's where the
JBL,
project came from.
you've published your book on it now, and I want people to get the book, but the JBL thing is part of the history of it. And I'm
Yep.
so glad I asked you this. I love the story, and people follow Bart, and they're going to enjoy this a lot. And any of us, it also reminds me of this conference again, which I want to highlight again because we're coming up to the end of our hour here, is that you were just reading the text and just thinking and thinking and thinking. You hadn't done all the background work yet. You had this idea, if Hosea does in fact mean the scattered tribes, and Paul quotes it, it's usually taken as, yeah, it's kind of a nice analogy for non-Jews. Let's call them not my people, but it isn't like that. He actually quotes it and says that it's happening. And we say this conference is for non-specialists. And I'm telling you, I've taught for 43 years at 3 universities. So many times I'll have a student like you who just has deeply thought about this thing. And these are the kind of people that come to this sort of event,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why we say for the non-scholar, the non-specialist, because this, you teach, the students, many of them have pored over these texts for years, and they see something that one of us hasn't seen. And we love that. I mean, we can get a little stuffy sometimes, but you're not stuffy. I don't think I am either. I mean, I love to hear ideas and what people think. So
Yeah,
this,
I think it's a major problem if
yeah,
we
we just,
if
well,
we
what if we went
fence
by,
ourselves in the ivory tower.
Kuhn or Kuhn, and we have our theological dictionary of the Bible. I'm going to look up Jew. I'm going to look Israelite. I'm not, I don't know anything about his life other than things you've said, just the Nazi background and so forth. So it's not simply that, but that's just an illustration of how you might look something up. I was talking to Robin Faith Walsh the other day, and she's a classics major. And then she took a New Testament course, and it's the same thing. It's very similar. She said, yeah, I suddenly read the New Testament, and all these words that people were saying, look in your Art and Gingrich or your Bauer, and I would look and go, no, that's not what
That's
it
not what that
means.
means.
That's not what it
Yeah,
means.
yeah,
Everybody in town is using it this other way. And so you were sort of doing that. You were looking at it and so forth. So just to be clear on that passage, are you saying that anyone drawn in, according to Paul, anyone drawn in by his preaching to the not my people, Gentiles, nations, they're ethnically somehow descended from the tribes, or is there some spiritual connection that Paul thought? I mean, either way, for him, I think it's a fact.
yeah,
And is
yeah.
that what
So
he
I
means? All who's Israel is Israel, and they're all going to come back. That I don't know that he meant every individual was a universalist or not, but certainly he had hordes of people coming, and he would say, "Yeah, these are your brothers, right?
mhm.
These are your scattered brothers." Is
Yeah,
it
so I don't think he's making the case that all of the people who are receiving the Spirit are somehow like if we trace their genealogy back far
DNA or
enough.
something? Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I don't think he's quite doing that. And in fact, I suspect that when we get to the pastoral epistles and you read in First Timothy this warning about pouring, endless genealogies, that actually gives us a context to think about why people would be looking into those endless genealogies of like maybe trying to find if they had some sort of Israelite ancestor in the
And he
past.
doesn't like that because then you're
Right.
going more by the
And
flesh. Yeah. Mhm.
right. And I think whether that, First Timothy's by Paul or not, and I think most of us think that it probably wasn't, I think that actually gets Paul fundamentally right in that what Paul's saying is not that whoever receives the Spirit must be, descended from Israelite DNA in some fashion. I think his argument is that Israel gets so assimilated among the various nations by
Yeah.
intermarriage that in order to bring Israel back, God just decides to bring in the whole all the nations because Israel has sort of alloyed into the nations,
And
right?
don't
There's
the
been they've
prophets say that when Israel comes back, the nations in a way get drawn as well? Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
And
So it's he
Paul
doesn't
says these
say
are
it's
not
the same
separate
thing.
movements.
Right.
Exactly.
They're the
He says
people
this is
of
all
God.
happening through
Right.
one movement.
Right. Wow.
So,
Hmm.
and so that's what I think is happening and he sees that as an ethnic transformation so that people who are not Israelites by receiving the spirit or the pneuma of of Israel's Messiah are ethnic like they become a part of his body and by being in his body they become Israel. They become Israelites because they're in that like they are connected in an almost material sense, but they become ethnically transformed by
And
receiving the
they
spirit.
do. I mean, they start talking about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They start referring to the Exodus, and it becomes their stories now, and their narratives are not narratives of the history of Zeus or Serapis or Isis. It's the history that they're beginning to get, probably reading the Torah in Greek if they didn't know Hebrew. So, in a
Yeah,
way,
and Paul
he's
says in
Judaizing them in a funny way. If I mean, that's not a perfect term, but well, he says you've turned from idols in First Thessalonians to serve the living and true God and to wait for his son from heaven. That's kind of Pauline, summarizing everything right there in First
yeah,
Thessalonians 9 and 10.
yeah, and in First Corinthians 10 he says when our fathers were in the
Our
wilderness,
fathers, yeah, what does that
right?
mean? Our fathers.
Right?
You're
So
part of
he's
us now.
including He's including the Corinthian audience, and among whom are Gentiles,
Yeah.
and he's saying that their fathers, their patriarchs, their ancestors were in the wilderness in the Exodus.
Yeah, he does
Wait,
say that.
what?
Right. Yeah.
That's
So
a big statement.
we got to wrap up. So here's what I want to ask you, but you can't give away the secret. But what are you going to talk about at the conference? We've got the description. I'll put it back up for everybody. So here's Jason. Uh, and I don't want you to give anything away. I want you to tantalize us. What are you going to say that will make me? I mean, I'm going to hear you. I'm going to hear you. I'm going to hear everybody live. And I'm sure most of us will if our schedule permits, but eventually I will hear everybody. So give us your pitch on why we should listen to this coming up in September.
Will do. And by the way, before I forget, I'll mention also, I also had a major classics background in my undergrad and master's work,
Oh, okay.
which had me doing the same thing in many cases as
Yeah, I majored in Greek in college with
yeah.
Abraham Malherbe, the
Oh,
great
okay.
Testament
Yeah.
scholar. So it's the same
Yeah.
thing, so yeah.
Yeah. So I still vividly remember in a class at Florida State when we were translating Aeschylus, and we came across the word charis. And the professor, Francis Cairns, stopped the class for a second. He said, "This is a really important word in Greek. And it is always and everywhere a reciprocal word, a term that implies reciprocal strings attached." And that was one where I kind of knew that word a little bit from the New Testament, but all of a sudden, like, I'm thinking, wow, this is important to
So
think
it's
about.
like grace or gift, supposedly, is
Yeah,
what people
yeah.
normally, yeah.
Yeah, but there's an inherent reciprocity to it
Okay.
in every case when it's used in the Greek language, and that was an important point that came up in a classics context
Hmm.
that then was important for me to hear for later work. Anyway, so when we get to what we're going to do for the new insights in the New Testament stuff, so I'm going to be talking. I mean, the abstract says a lot there about what I'm going to do, but basically I'm going to look at why the notion that Paul preaches salvation by faith alone doesn't get Paul right. The term by faith alone only appears one time in the New Testament, and it's preceded by the word not in James
Hmm.
2:26, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
not by faith alone appears more times in the Bible than by faith alone. Unless you're reading Luther's Bible, where Luther added the word alone
Yeah.
in a few places in Galatians,
Sola
and
fide. Yeah.
yeah.
Supposedly you wrote it in the margin or something. Yeah.
So, so my argument is going to be that Paul understands salvation as, or my presentation will be that Paul understands salvation as contingent on judgment, and he is, as other Jews in his day, and Jews historically have believed, he believed that God is a God of justice, and that people will ultimately get what they deserve from God. And when everyone stands before God in judgment, God will dispense judgment justly. And that's a problem for people who do wrong. For people who are unjust and impious, those people are going to get a bad judgment. So the real question then is, if God is actually just and we deserve really bad things, we deserve a bad judgment. How can that change? And how can that change? How can God be merciful? How can God show mercy while still remaining just?
Mhm.
And I then explain how Paul's understanding of receiving the Spirit and the work of Christ and all of these things tie into what he sees as a transformation, not in the sense of people, just getting a pass, or God sees Jesus and not you, this notion that's foreign
He
to Paul.
overlooks your sins. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, that God just overlooks your sins,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
rather Paul preaches a gospel that's all about transformation and people becoming actual
Hmm.
doers of justice. And then when you stand before God in the judgment, if you have become a doer of justice by the power of the Holy Spirit, then you will be judged justly as
Right.
just. And so that's going to be the focus of the paper or of the presentation,
Right.
and hopefully can
And
polish that
I
up
want to
and
say to
make it
people,
clear.
because I have a very diverse YouTube audience, from non-believers and skeptics to believers. And if you read my comments, you'll see the infinite variety of YouTube listeners and viewers, most of whom are fairly polite and decent, some of whom aren't. But I want to tell everybody that what Jason is presenting here, whether we're trying to get Paul right, and someone could, I tell people, I wrote a book, Paul and Jesus. They go, "Oh, I hate Paul. I would never read that book." Or, "I love Paul. It was so great." I get both reactions. And I try to tell people, Jason, I know you feel this way too. I want to get him right. Now, if somebody then looks to Paul or thinks Paul did see Jesus and he received revelation, it's not honoring him to get the wrong ideas. Like Romans 11, what did he mean when he said that? So keep in mind, historians of religion, Bart makes it known that he's not a Christian believer. He gave it up. But that doesn't mean, look at how much he said, I'm so fascinated with this material. I think about it all the time. Why? Why would he do that? Well, first of all, it's the most influential set of ideas on the planet, and it keeps growing. So whether you're, I always say, a Paul hater or a Paul lover or somewhere in the middle, or you don't even know about Paul, we got a whole conference that's going to be looking at all this. And I'm particularly interested in Ben's thing about the letters, because many of us start with those 7 early letters. And it sounds like he might be raising, deconstructing that but every one
He
of,
is. I've seen some
yeah,
of the
you
early
already know.
stuff on that, and it's going
And
to
I'm
be
open. I
really
mean,
good.
I am open to, if you want to show me Second Thessalonians, or I started to say Second Timothy, or whatever he's going to say. I mean, since that's my specialty, I certainly need to know what my best sources are. So every single lecture is going to be great. So I hope just look at the page. I'll put it in the description. And whether you decide to attend or not, you know, I want you to get introduced to it. And that's why I had Jason on right now. In the future, I want to dig into this book, but particularly the new book that deals with what we talked about, Romans 9, 10, and 11. I think it's, well, you already
And
quoted,
and to briefly build on what you just said
yeah.
about, whether you reject Paul, whether you believe or whatever, there's an old saying, there's an old phrase that, in traditional Jewish interpretation of arguing or interpreting Lashem Shemayim, right?
Mhm.
That it's trying to understand before you have any dog in the hunt. Like, even if I'm wrong, what I really want to know is, I want to push forward. You want to push forward to try to get things right in a disinterested fashion, and then we can make our decisions on what we think after that. But it's that kind
Exactly.
of argument
Yeah.
that we really want to do.
And I try to make that clear because I delve into deep things about Paul all the time, and people go, "God, he's just obsessed with Paul." Well, I sort of am. I mean, in the sense that I'm trying to figure out a lot of things. I think he's the most influential human in history. So I really don't need to apologize for devoting 4 decades to studying him. And I'll tell you my Dr. Vater story when I proposed to Jonathan Z. Smith at Chicago, the great historian of religions, now passed, sadly, and missed. I said, I want to work on Paul. No one had ever done a New Testament dissertation with Smith at that time on, uh, Paul, or even the Gospels at that time. And when I told him my idea, it was sort of like you. I said, I want to deal with Paul's ascent to paradise in Second Corinthians. Well, he then lit up because, oh, well, if you're going to get into Hellenistic religions and the ascent traditions and all of this, fine. You're, in other words, we're not a seminary, it's the University of Chicago, but if you're going to handle it that way. And he ended up loving what I did. And I don't think he had any idea of what I would end up doing. it's wonderful to have these experiences. I was very young, like you were, truly a babe in the woods, coming to Chicago, and in a way I knew a lot, in a way I didn't know anything. So I'm sure you
Yeah.
know the
I still
feeling.
feel that way.
Yeah, yeah. So it's great to talk to you. I've always loved listening to your interviews. I want to also talk about you talk about the sports thing. I hope people will go to your page, jasonstaples.com. If you can remember Jason's name, you got it. And subscribe to his Substack. And even though, the books might look a little expensive, I don't know if they're in Kindle yet or anything. They might be. Do you know if
They are.
Cambridge is doing that?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, they
They
are. And
are.
they're both in I think the one's $34 for the
Well,
hardback and
yeah.
the other's
These are
38
not
or
like
something like that.
tiny little books. Let's see. This one is 400 pages, and the other one's that length or more. So they're solid books. Cambridge University Press ain't bad in terms of getting accepted. I'm really glad that they accepted it, and I look forward to seeing you virtually, but also, hey, we live in North Carolina. We got to get
Yeah.
together. We'll meet halfway. You're in Raleigh, I guess. So yeah,
Yeah, a little south of Raleigh now,
a little
but yeah.
south of Raleigh.
Yeah.
Okay, Jason, thanks so much for coming on, and hope to see a lot of people at the conference. By the way, there's mixers and Q&A things. Look at the page. I gotta mention the early bird pricing ends Sunday, and it does save you, I think, about a third. So at least check it out. You can always sign up later, but the price is going to go up like this. So it'll be the largest classroom you could imagine, and yet we'll do it virtually. It'll be great.
It's one of the best things about the internet.
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye. I hope this can be the first of lots of other talks. Thanks so much.
Thank you
Take
so
care.
much.
Okay.
This was wonderful.